early 30s, Dutch inventor Cornelis Pot presented the world with a radically new method of reading and writing music, Klavarskribo. He had rejected the complicated notation system that has existed for hundreds of years.
Klavarskribo, that means keyboard writing. Klavaro, that's keyboard, and skribo, that's writing.
Pot grew up in a musical atmosphere that left a great impression on him. Now in his 89th year, he remembers that as a boy, the reality of accomplished playing always eluded him.
Well, as a boy of 13, 14 years, I got my first piano lessons, and it struck me that they had for one tone, they had many, many different figures, indications. And for one indication, you had many tones. And I asked why that was, but nobody could explain it. They say that's higher science, and you will hear later. But I never heard. And that was the reason that when I grew older, I took up the problem and solved it in the way as Klaver does now. And from the most complicated notation in music, it came to the most simple one. There's no simple notation, and it will spread over the whole world, I'm sure.
These complex-looking manuscripts were written in the early part of the 19th century by Beethoven. This method of notation is still used today, the major developments having taken place between the 9th and 16th centuries. The ancient Greeks are believed to have been the first people to attempt to write down their music using a system of 15 letters. This was later adopted by the Romans, who translated the letters into Latin. They used instruments like the drum, tambourine, and the aulus, which was similar to the oboe, but there is no trace of their written music. There is no record of progress until the 9th century, when a form of notation was devised to show the accents of Roman Catholic chants. The religious melodies were passed on orally, but simple signs placed between the words of the chants were used as memory aids. These signs, called neumes, were by themselves incapable of evoking a tone or rhythm. In a later system, the neumes were placed at varying distances from an imaginary line. At the end of the 10th century, the line became real. As a natural progression, two lines were used, the top one colored red, indicating F, the bottom one green for C. These letters were also used when the four-line stave was developed during the 13th century. And about the same time, the neumes acquired the square shapes that are still used in the Roman Catholic Church. Methods varied from country to country in much the same way as spoken language does. In the 13th and 14th centuries, there followed an extremely rapid development involving frequent changes and innovation. Notation became more and more complex up to the first half of the 15th century. At this time, it was to some extent simplified, resulting in the classical system of notation characterized by white notes instead of black ones. So, by the 16th century, notation as we know it today was in existence. The stave had grown to 5 lines carrying more complicated signs. Additional symbols such as key signatures, expression marks, and tempo marks were added to the system. Unfortunately, reading and writing became very difficult, and even great composers like Mozart struggled to learn.
We have learned it in this way, and that was a difficult way, and that it was a difficult way, I can prove you, because, and you can see it yourself, if you go to Salzburg, you can go in the room where there is an inscription on the door. This is the room where Mozart pleaded the most tears with his father to study music.
On a visit to America, Cornelis Pot, to prove the simplicity of Klaver, made a certain bet.
Oh, in Chicago, yes. I gave a demonstration with Lyons and Healy, I believe the firm was. They make harps. That's the only harp maker in the world, I believe. And I made a certain bet with the direction that in half an hour I would play a duet on the piano with one of their employees, and who never played the piano before. It was arranged for 3 o'clock, and all the people came together, and I gave the instructions, and after these instructions was a very clever girl. We played the duet to the admiration of all the present people. And it was not half an hour, but it was only 7 minutes. And that was the demonstration how easy Klavarskribo is. And to my opinion, the difference is so enormous that it must conquer the whole world.
By the 16th century, the notation system we know today was firmly established. There were 2 rows of 5 horizontal lines, known as staves. These provided the musicians and composers with a common point of reference on which the notes were written. 8 tones made up an octave, known as the diatonic scale. But musicians were not content with the limited range of 8 tones, and, in the early Middle Ages, 5 extra tones were added to the original 8. This was known as the chromatic scale, with 12 equal intervals, and was first used by Bach himself. But with these extra tones, the stave remained the same, and so there was no extra room. Makeshift signs, called sharps and flats, were introduced. These sharps and flats are never shown together at the beginning of a stave, so the example is exaggerated. But the need to remember this number of signs is no exaggeration. To make things even more complicated, double sharps, double flats, and naturals were introduced into the notation system. 21 different ways were developed to indicate the duration of each tone. Complicated rhythms led to more complicated notation signs. As music freed itself from material restrictions and rose to the heights of Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, so the clarity of music diminished. With the vast amount of theoretical knowledge necessary, sight reading became more and more difficult. This is an example of a composition with the 2 rows of 5 lines in the treble and bass clefs. At the beginning of the stave, there are 7 flats. As well, there are individual signs, such as sharps and naturals. What we have is a system with the emphasis on theory. At the beginning of the stave, the musician can fairly easily refer to the symbols. As he moves further from the left, he has to rely more upon his ability to remember. So music has gone on developing from generation to generation, while the notation ceased to develop 300 years ago. Pott's rejection of the system was based on his own frustrations as a boy. To get a more direct visual comparison with a keyboard, he turned the stave through 90 degrees.
If you keep the stave horizontal, you must, of course, every chord that you read, you must in your mind make a turn of a quarter of a circle, in this way, 90 degrees. Therefore, I decided to put the stave vertical. To put the stave vertical, in this way. Therefore, the decision was made to put in clava the stave vertical, in this way.
To make the stave vertical was not in itself enough. Pott wanted to make the lines more recognizable, to give musicians and composers clearer points of reference. So the clava stave was to consist of rows of black lines, identical to the black keys on the piano, with the spaces in between the lines representing the white keys. The groups of 3 lines, leading to the sets of 3 black keys, were thicker than the groups of 2 lines leading to the 2 black keys. The pair of lines in the center were dotted to show the center of the keyboard, middle C. Black notes are shown by black dots on the black lines. On the keyboard, this indicates the striking of the black key. The white notes are white circles or dots in between the lines. The clava stave thus provides a separate place for all the notes in an octave, unlike the old notation which has room for only 8 of the 13 notes. So, written notes appeared like this. All notes played with the right hand have a stem to the right. Notes with stems to the left are played with the left hand. Timing in the old notation can be indicated in no less than 21 different ways. In clava, the stave is divided into bars, which are logically divided into equal beats. The duration value of each note is shown graphically, the vertical distances between notes indicating the time interval between them. A direct comparison between the keyboard and the clava stave is very convincing. Although clava identifies with the keyboard, it is always indicating a tone, making it suitable for all musical instruments